November 1941. Erwin Rommel stands in his command tent somewhere in the Libyan desert, staring at a report that makes no sense. 7 ships. All 7 ships gone. An entire convoy carrying tanks, fuel, ammunition, everything his Afrika Korps needs to continue the siege of Tobruk, sent to the bottom of the Mediterranean in a single night. And the attackers? 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers operating from an island he could fit inside the boundaries of his own headquarters camp. The report from Italian Naval Command describes what happened. A British force, designated Force K, intercepted the convoy near Cape Spartivento. The engagement lasted minutes. The British ships emerged without a single casualty. Not one shell struck them. Not one torpedo found its mark. They simply appeared in the darkness, silhouetted the convoy against the moonlight, and systematically destroyed everything that floated. Rommel knows this island. Malta, a speck of rock 95 square miles, in total area, smaller than most German counties, positioned 60 miles south of Sicily, in the middle of the Mediterranean. And from this speck, from this tiny fortress that should have been neutralized months ago, the British are strangling his supply lines with methodical, devastating precision. He has warned Berlin about this. He has pleaded with Rome. And now, watching his fuel reserves drop and his tank strength wither, he is beginning to understand something that will haunt him for the rest of the North African campaign. This island, this insignificant piece of limestone in the middle of the sea, will determine whether he reaches Cairo or dies in the desert trying. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of Malta and Rommel's supplies is not a story of great battles or dramatic turning points. It is a story of mathematics, tonnages and distances, consumption rates and shipping schedules, the cold arithmetic of logistics that determines whether armies advance or starve. And in this arithmetic, geography is destiny. Malta sits almost exactly in the center of the Mediterranean Sea. From its harbors and airfields, British aircraft can reach the Italian mainland. British submarines can patrol the shipping lanes between Naples and Tripoli. British warships can intercept convoys at their most vulnerable point, the narrow passage between Sicily and Tunisia, where every ship bound for North Africa must pass. The island is 17 miles long and 9 miles wide. Its population in 1940 numbered approximately 270,000 souls. It possesses no natural resources, no significant agriculture, no industrial capacity. Everything Malta needs to survive must be brought in by sea. And yet this seemingly helpless island fortress will sink more of Rommel's supplies than all his battlefield defeats combined. To understand why, you must understand the supply problem facing the Afrika Korps from the moment Rommel arrived in February 1941. North Africa is not like France or Poland or Russia. There are no railways spanning the desert, no industrial centers to capture and exploit, no local populations capable of feeding an army. Every bullet fired by the Afrika Korps must cross the Mediterranean from Europe. Every gallon of fuel burned by Rommel's panzers must travel by ship from Italian ports to Tripoli or Benghazi. Every replacement soldier, every spare part, every ration must make that voyage. The mathematics are simple and brutal. Rommel's forces require approximately 50,000 tons of supplies per month to maintain offensive operations. The Italian merchant fleet, already stretched thin by the demands of their own forces, must transport these supplies across 300 miles of open water. And waiting along every mile of that journey are the forces based at Malta. The British recognized Malta's importance from the war's beginning. Winston Churchill called it an unsinkable aircraft carrier positioned directly athwart the enemy's supply lines. The naval strategists in London understood that controlling Malta meant controlling the central Mediterranean. Losing Malta would open a clear path for Axis convoys and potentially doom the entire British position in Egypt. But recognition is not the same as capability. In the summer of 1940, when Italy entered the war, Malta's defences were pathetically weak. The island possessed exactly 4 antiquated Gloucester Gladiator biplanes, so few that legend claims they were nicknamed Faith, Hope, and Charity. The anti-aircraft defences were inadequate. The garrison was unprepared for sustained assault. What saved Malta in those early months was Italian hesitation. Mussolini's air force bombed the island repeatedly, but never with the concentration necessary to neutralize it. Italian naval commanders, burned by their experience at Taranto, where British carrier aircraft devastated their fleet, were reluctant to risk major surface actions near Malta's waters. The window of opportunity for an easy Axis conquest closed before anyone in Rome or Berlin recognized it had been open. By the time Rommel arrived in North Africa, Malta was being reinforced. Hurricane fighters replaced the gladiators. Submarines of the 10th Flotilla began arriving at the ancient fortress on Manuel Island. Bomber squadrons established themselves at the island's airfields, and the British began doing what they do best in wartime. They began improvising a system of systematic destruction aimed at everything that floated between Italy and Africa. The 10th Submarine Flotilla deserves particular attention because its story illuminates the nature of Malta's war. These were not the large fleet submarines designed for ocean patrols. The U-class boats that formed the flotilla's backbone were originally designed for training, small vessels of roughly 500 tons, displacement with limited range and modest armament. They were sent to Malta because their compact size made them ideal for the Mediterranean's clear, shallow waters, where larger submarines could be spotted from the air. Under Commander George Simpson, known as Shrimp for his small stature, these boats conducted operations of extraordinary daring. The distances were short. A submarine leaving Malta could reach the Italian convoy routes in hours. It could attack, reload, and attack again without returning to base. The risk was correspondingly high. The Mediterranean offered little room to hide, and Italian anti-submarine forces, while inconsistent, could be deadly when they found their targets. The most successful of these boats was HMS Upholder, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Malcolm David Wanklyn. Over 16 months and 24 patrols, Upholder sank approximately 130,000 tons of Axis shipping, making it the most successful British submarine of the entire war. Wanklyn's most famous action came on May 24, 1941, when he intercepted a convoy carrying troops to reinforce Rommel's offensive. His target was the Conte Rosso, an 18,000-ton liner packed with Italian soldiers. Wanklyn attacked despite heavy escort, launching torpedoes at close range, while destroyers hunted him. 2 torpedoes struck the liner, which sank in minutes with the loss of over 1,300 men. The escort ships counterattacked for hours, dropping depth charges that shook Upholder to her frames. Wanklyn evaded them all, returning to Malta to a hero's welcome and ultimately the Victoria Cross. But Upholder's story ended as so many submarine stories did. In April 1942, she departed on her 25th patrol and never returned. Italian records suggest she was caught by the torpedo boat Pegaso and destroyed by depth charges northeast of Tripoli. Wanklyn and his entire crew were lost. Between January 1941 and September 1942, the 10th Flotilla's 12 submarines accounted for over 400,000 tons of Axis shipping. More than half those submarines were themselves sunk in action. Rommel watched these losses mount with growing fury. His staff calculated consumption rates against delivery schedules and produced numbers that spelled disaster. In the summer of 1941, roughly 94% of supplies shipped to North Africa arrived safely. By autumn, that figure began dropping. In November 1941, the month Force K destroyed the entire Duisburg convoy. Axis supply losses exceeded 60%. Only 30,000 tons of supplies reached North Africa that month, a fraction of what Rommel needed. The impact was immediate and devastating. Rommel had planned to attack Tobruk, the fortress that had held out against him since April. His offensive required fuel for mobile operations, ammunition for sustained combat, reinforcements to replace his losses from Operation Crusader, the British counter-offensive that had caught him off balance. None of these arrived in sufficient quantities. In his communications with Berlin, Rommel's frustration becomes increasingly apparent. He complained to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht about supply shortages so severe that his aircraft could fly only one sortie per day. He demanded that something be done about Malta. He warned, with prescience that went unheeded, that the Axis would lose control of North Africa entirely if this tiny island remained in British hands. The exact words Rommel used in May 1941 have been preserved. Without Malta, the Axis will end by losing control of North Africa. He understood the strategic reality with perfect clarity. Every tank he lost in battle could theoretically be replaced. Every ton of fuel he consumed could theoretically be resupplied, but only if the convoys got through. And as long as Malta remained operational, the convoys would not get through in sufficient numbers. The British strategy for Malta was deceptively simple. The island's forces would attack Axis shipping with every available weapon, submarines, surface ships, aircraft, but they would do so with careful attention to sustainability. Unlike Rommel, who repeatedly outran his supplies, the Malta commanders understood that this was a war of attrition. What mattered was not spectacular single victories, but the steady, grinding destruction of Axis logistics. The results spoke for themselves. In the 5 months from June to October 1941, Malta-based forces sank approximately 220,000 tons of Axis shipping. This included tankers carrying the fuel Rommel desperately needed, freighters loaded with tanks and artillery, troop ships bringing reinforcements. Each sinking forced the Axis to recalculate, to reschedule, to send replacement cargoes that might themselves be intercepted. Force K's formation in October 1941 represented a new phase in Malta's war. The surface force, initially comprising just 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers, added a dimension that submarines and aircraft could not provide. Surface ships could operate in conditions that grounded aircraft. They could intercept convoys that submarines had missed, and they could deliver the kind of concentrated, devastating attack that left nothing afloat. The Duisburg convoy action demonstrated what Force K could achieve. On November 8, a reconnaissance aircraft from Malta spotted the convoy forming in Naples harbour. Force K sailed to intercept. That night, using radar and skilled seamanship, the British ships positioned themselves perfectly. The convoy was silhouetted against the moon. The escorts were on the wrong side to protect the merchant ships. And then Force K opened fire. The action lasted less than an hour. All 7 merchant ships were sunk. 1 escorting destroyer was destroyed, 2 others damaged. Force K returned to Malta without a scratch. The implications of this attack terrified Italian Naval Command so thoroughly that they temporarily suspended convoy operations entirely, leaving Rommel's forces without any seaborne supply at all. Churchill, following events from London, saw an opportunity. He pushed the Mediterranean Command to reinforce Force K, to add more cruisers and destroyers, to exploit the temporary Italian paralysis. 2 more light cruisers and additional destroyers joined the Malta force, now strong enough to challenge even heavily escorted convoys. The destruction rate climbed toward the figure that would become legendary: 60% of Axis supplies failing to reach North Africa in November 1941. This was not merely inconvenient for Rommel, it was catastrophic. An army cannot function when more than half its supplies disappear before reaching the front. The Afrika Korps was being strangled, and everyone knew it except those who refused to see. What Rommel said about this situation fills the communications records of the period. He blamed Italian naval incompetence, not entirely without justification. He demanded German air support to suppress Malta's offensive capability. He pleaded for reinforcements that might allow him to break through to Egypt before his logistics collapsed entirely. And above all, he demanded that Malta itself be captured or neutralized. The demand for action against Malta reached the highest levels. Hitler and Mussolini discussed it. German planners developed Operation Hercules, an ambitious combined airborne and seaborne assault that would have landed German paratroopers and Italian Marines on Malta's rocky shores. The plan called for 500 transport aircraft, thousands of elite troops, and the concentrated support of Luftwaffe units transferred from the Eastern Front. But Hercules was never executed. The disaster at Crete in May 1941, where German airborne forces suffered enormous casualties despite ultimately capturing the island, made Hitler reluctant to risk another large-scale parachute operation. The demands of the Russian campaign drew resources away from the Mediterranean, and always, the Italian Navy's caution meant that any amphibious operation would lack adequate naval support. Instead, the Germans chose a different approach. They would bomb Malta into impotence. In December 1941, Luftwaffe Field Marshal Albert Kesselring arrived to take command of German forces in the Mediterranean. His primary mission was to neutralize Malta through sustained air attack, allowing Axis convoys to pass unmolested. The bombing campaign that followed would transform Malta into the most bombed place on Earth. But that is a story for the next part of this narrative. What matters here is understanding what this tiny island accomplished before the full weight of Axis air power descended upon it. Between January and November 1941, Malta-based forces fundamentally changed the strategic situation in North Africa. They did not defeat Rommel in battle, they did not drive him from the desert, but they ensured that he could never fully exploit his tactical victories because the supplies he needed to do so never arrived. Consider the mathematics once more. The Afrika Korps required approximately 50,000 tons of supplies monthly for offensive operations. In November 1941, they received 30,000 tons. That 20,000-ton deficit translated directly into tanks that could not be replaced, fuel that could not power mobile operations, ammunition that could not support sustained combat. Rommel's retreat from Operation Crusader, his forced withdrawal from positions near Tobruk to the starting lines at El Agheila, owes as much to Malta's submarines and ships as to British tanks and infantry. He simply could not sustain the logistics necessary to resist a determined British offensive. His panzers ran short of fuel, his artillery rationed shells, his replacement soldiers never arrived. The invisible war, the war of convoys and submarines and midnight surface actions, proved decisive even when the visible war remained in doubt. January 1942. The skies above Malta darken with German aircraft. Kesselring has begun his campaign to bomb the island into submission, and he is doing so with the methodical thoroughness that characterizes German military operations. Day after day, night after night, formations of Junkers Ju 88 seconds and Stuka dive bombers pound the harbors, the airfields, the submarine base at Manuel Island. The statistics from this period are almost incomprehensible. From January 1st to July 24th, 1942, there was only one 24-hour period when no bombs fell on Malta. The island endured 154 consecutive days and nights of aerial bombardment. In April alone, Luftwaffe aircraft flew approximately 9,500 sorties over the island, dropping nearly 7,000 tons of bombs. This exceeded the monthly tonnage dropped on London during the worst of the Blitz. The 270,000 civilians living on Malta had nowhere to go. The island offers no countryside to evacuate to, no neutral territory to flee across. The population retreated underground, carving shelters into the limestone rock, living like troglodytes, while the world above them burned. Diseases spread through the cramped shelters: dysentery, typhoid, scabies, tuberculosis. Food grew scarce as convoys struggled to reach the island. By summer, the daily bread ration had fallen to barely 4 ounces per person. Force K, which had achieved such devastating success in November, was crippled in December 1941. On the 19th, the cruisers and destroyers sailed to intercept yet another convoy. They ran into an Italian minefield off Tripoli. The cruiser Neptune struck 4 mines and sank, with nearly all hands. The destroyer Kandahar was so badly damaged she had to be scuttled. The cruiser Aurora limped back to Malta with severe damage. In a single night, the surface striking force that had terrorized Axis convoys was reduced to 1 operational cruiser. The timing could not have been worse. With Force K effectively destroyed and Kesselring's bombers suppressing Malta's air power, the supply route to North Africa suddenly became passable. In January 1942, Rommel received 55 new tanks and substantial fuel reserves. He immediately launched a counteroffensive that caught the British completely by surprise. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Within 2 weeks, Rommel recaptured almost all the ground he had lost during Operation Crusader. His panzers drove the British back from El Agheila to Gazala, a retreat of several hundred miles. The Afrika Corps, which had seemed on the verge of collapse in November, was suddenly resurgent. And the reason was simple. Supplies were finally getting through. The correlation was not lost on strategic observers on either side. When Malta struck effectively, Rommel retreated. When Malta was suppressed, Rommel advanced. The island's fate and the desert campaign's outcome were locked together in an inescapable strategic embrace. The bombing reached its terrible crescendo in April and May 1942. Kesselring believed he was on the verge of achieving his objective. Malta's airfields were cratered wastelands. The submarine base at Manuel Island was heavily damaged, forcing the 10th Flotilla to temporarily withdraw. The few fighters remaining on the island, Hurricanes hopelessly outclassed by the latest Messerschmitt Bf 109Fs, could barely contest the skies. On April 15, 1942, in the midst of this apocalyptic bombardment, King George VI made an ATMA, unprecedented decision. He awarded the George Cross, the highest civilian honour in the British Empire, to the entire island of Malta. The citation read, "To honour her brave people, I award the George Cross to the island fortress of Malta to bear witness to a heroism and devotion that will long be famous in history." It was the first time a civilian decoration had been awarded collectively to an entire population. The medal itself arrived in May, carried by the new governor, Lord Gort, in his pocket, as his flying boat descended through an air raid to land at Calafrana. The formal presentation ceremony would wait until September, when the bombing had diminished enough to permit a public gathering. But the George Cross, however deserved, did not sink supply ships. What Malta needed was aircraft, fuel, food, and the means to resume offensive operations. What Malta was receiving instead was bombs. The convoys that might have saved the island paid a terrible price. In February, 3 ships attempted to reach Malta from Alexandria. None arrived. In March, 4 ships tried again, escorted by cruisers and destroyers that fought a brilliant delaying action against a vastly superior Italian surface force in the Second Battle of Sirte. 3 of the 4 merchant ships reached Malta's approaches, but German bombers waiting offshore destroyed them before their cargoes could be fully unloaded. Only 7,500 of 26,000 tons of supplies embarked at Alexandria actually reached Maltese warehouses. In June, the British mounted a 2-pronged effort, Operation Harpoon from Gibraltar and Operation Vigorous from Alexandria. Both were disasters. Only 2 merchant ships from Harpoon reached Malta, and none from Vigorous, which was forced to turn back under sustained air attack. The sole tanker in the combined convoys was sunk, leaving Malta without fuel for its aircraft. By August 1942, Lord Gort advised London that Malta would be forced to surrender by early September if supplies did not arrive. The island had food for perhaps 2 more weeks. Aviation fuel was nearly exhausted. Ammunition for the anti-aircraft batteries was being rationed to a few rounds per gun per raid. The most bombed place on Earth was on the verge of capitulation. The response was Operation Pedestal, the largest and most powerful convoy escort the Royal Navy had ever assembled. 14 merchant ships loaded with food, ammunition, and other supplies departed Gibraltar on August 9th. Among them was the American-built tanker Ohio, carrying 11,500 tons of fuel, oil and kerosene, without which Malta's aircraft could not fly. The escort fleet numbered over 50 warships, including 2 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 7 cruisers, and 32 destroyers. The Navy understood that this convoy had to get through. If it failed, Malta would fall. And if Malta fell, Rommel would receive unimpeded supplies, perhaps enough to finally break through to the Suez Canal. What followed was one of the most savage convoy battles of the war. On August 11th, the aircraft carrier Eagle was torpedoed by a German submarine and sank in 8 minutes with the loss of over 200 men. The following day, as the convoy passed into the narrow waters between Sicily and Tunisia, the attacks intensified. Italian submarines, German bombers, and Italian torpedo planes struck in waves. The cruiser Cairo was sunk. The cruiser Nigeria was torpedoed. The cruiser Manchester was so badly damaged she had to be scuttled. Destroyers rushed between burning merchant ships, rescuing survivors, laying smoke screens, firing at attackers that seemed to come from every direction. One by one, the merchant ships died. Empire Hope, Clan Ferguson, Waimarama, Glenorchy, Deucalion, Santa Elisa. Their names became a roll call of sacrifice. The Ohio, the irreplaceable tanker, was hit repeatedly. A near miss buckled her plates. A crashing German bomber struck her deck. Another aircraft bounced off the water and hit her side. Italian torpedo planes scored direct hits, yet somehow, through damage that should have destroyed any ship, Ohio kept floating. On August 13th, with the convoy remnants approaching Malta, the situation was desperate. Ohio had lost all propulsion. Her deck was awash. Her cargo of fuel was all that stood between Malta and surrender. 2 destroyers lashed themselves to her sides. A third pushed from behind. Together, this improvised flotilla crept toward Grand Harbour at barely 2 knots. The Ohio entered Grand Harbour on August 15th, the feast of Santa Maria, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, Malta's most important religious holiday. Crowds lined the bastions, silent as the battered tanker was towed past. A band struck up Rule Britannia, then fell quiet. Men removed their hats, women crossed themselves. A bugle sounded the last post. The Ohio settled onto the harbour bottom even as the last of her fuel was being pumped out. But her cargo had arrived. Of 14 merchant ships that had departed Gibraltar, 5 reached Malta. Of the escorts, 1 aircraft carrier, 2 cruisers, and 1 destroyer were sunk, with several more damaged. Over 400 men died, but 32,000 tons of supplies were delivered, enough to keep Malta fighting. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The immediate aftermath of Pedestal saw Malta slowly recovering its offensive capability. Spitfires, superior to the Hurricanes that had struggled against German fighters, had been flown in from aircraft carriers in May. They now had fuel to fly. The bombing continued, but with diminishing intensity as Kesselring's Luftwaffe units were drawn away to support operations elsewhere. In September 1942, Malta resumed full offensive operations against Axis shipping. The results were immediate and devastating. Allied forces operating from Malta sank 100,000 tons of shipping that month, including 24,000 tons of fuel destined for Rommel. By October, Rommel was once again reporting critical supply shortages to Berlin. The mathematics that had briefly favoured the Afrika Korps now reversed with terrible finality. In September, Rommel lost 33% of his supplies to Malta-based attacks. In October, he lost 44%. In November, the month of El Alamein, more than half of everything shipped to North Africa never arrived. Rommel experienced the crisis firsthand. He had returned from medical leave in Germany to take command during the Second Battle of El Alamein, arriving on October 25th to find his army already crumbling under Montgomery's methodical assault. He had fuel for perhaps 3 days of mobile operations. His ammunition was rationed. His tanks, outnumbered 4-1 by British armour, could not be replaced. In his reports to Berlin during these desperate days, Rommel repeatedly cited supply failures as the primary cause of his army's disintegration. He had fuel stocks sufficient for perhaps 90 kilometres of movement. The distance from El Alamein to any defensible position was several times that. He could not counterattack because he could not manoeuvre. He could not retreat because he could not move. His army was dying of logistical starvation. The tanker Proserpina, carrying over 4,000 tons of fuel, sailed from Italy on October 20th. Malta-based aircraft intercepted and sank her on October 21st. The Tergeste followed on October 24th. sunk on October 26. The Louisiano, sailing with 3,000 tons of fuel, sunk on October 28. Each ship that went down took with it the fuel that might have given Rommel's panzers the mobility they needed. On November 2nd, Montgomery launched his final assault, Operation Supercharge. Rommel's lines broke. He ordered a retreat in direct violation of Hitler's victory or death command, knowing that to remain meant complete annihilation. The Afrika Korps began its long withdrawal across Libya, 1,500 miles of desert that would end only in Tunisia, and surrender. Throughout this retreat, Malta's forces continued their attacks. Every convoy that tried to reinforce Rommel's fleeing army ran the gauntlet of submarines, aircraft, and surface ships operating from the island he had warned about 18 months earlier. The predictions he had made in May 1941 proved horrifically accurate. Without Malta neutralized, the Axis had indeed lost control of North Africa. What did Rommel say about this? The historical record preserves his communications, his reports, his letters to his wife Lucy. He never stopped blaming supply failures for his defeats. He noted with bitter precision that the enemy seemed to know exactly where his convoys would be, exactly when they would be vulnerable. He complained about Italian naval incompetence, about German High Command's refusal to prioritize the Mediterranean, about the failure to capture Malta when it might still have been possible. But he never fully articulated what seems obvious in retrospect, that a piece of rock 95 square miles in area, populated by fewer than 300,000 people, defended by a handful of submarines and aircraft, had broken the back of his army. That the mathematics of logistics, the cold accounting of tons shipped and tons sunk, had proved more decisive than any tactical brilliance he could muster. His chief of staff, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, was more direct. After the war, interviewed about the Mediterranean campaign, Bayerlein admitted, "We should have taken Alexandria and reached the Suez Canal had it not been for the work of your submarines." He was speaking specifically of the Malta-based 10th Flotilla, the small boats that had sunk 250,000 tons of Axis shipping before being temporarily withdrawn. The final accounting of Malta's war is staggering in its implications. From June 1940 to the end of 1942, British forces operating from Malta sank or damaged over 1 million tons of Axis shipping. In the last 5 months of 1942 alone, when Rommel was fighting for survival at El Alamein and retreating across Libya, Malta's attacks claimed over 230,000 tons, the highest sinking rate achieved anywhere during the entire war. 7,000 people died on Malta during the siege, civilians and military personnel killed by bombs, disease, and starvation. The island endured more than 3,000 air raids, totaling over 2,300 hours of attack. 15,000 tons of bombs fell on an area 1/5 the size of London. The George Cross, awarded in April 1942, recognized suffering almost without parallel in the war. But the suffering had strategic purpose. Every bomb that fell on Malta was a bomb not falling on convoys. Every hour German pilots spent attacking the island was an hour not spent escorting supply ships. And despite everything Kesselring threw at it, Malta never stopped fighting. The submarines continued their patrols, the aircraft continued their strikes, the surface ships, when they could be spared, continued their deadly nighttime interceptions. In December 1942, with the siege effectively lifted and the Axis in full retreat across North Africa, Malta's offensive forces went on the attack with renewed fury. Over the next 5 months, they sank 200 to 30 additional Axis ships, the highest sustained sinking rate of the entire war. The supply situation for Axis forces trapped in Tunisia became so desperate that Germany resorted to massive air transport operations, flying in troops and supplies that the sea route could no longer deliver. Operation Flax in April 1943 saw Allied fighters destroy over 150 German transport aircraft in a single week, crippling the Luftwaffe's transport capability for the rest of the war. In May, the remaining Axis forces in Tunisia, over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers, surrendered. North Africa was lost, and with it, any hope of reaching the Middle Eastern oil fields that Hitler had dreamed of controlling. The question posed by the title asks what Rommel said when he learned about Malta's role in his defeat. The answer, like so many answers in history, is complex. He said many things at many times. He complained about supplies. He blamed Italian incompetence. He warned about the consequences of leaving Malta untaken. He noted the extraordinary effectiveness of British intelligence without understanding its true source. But perhaps the most revealing statement came not during the war but in its immediate aftermath, recorded in his papers before his forced suicide in October 1944. Reflecting on the North African campaign, he wrote that the supply problem had been fundamental from the beginning, that no tactical success could compensate for strategic strangulation, that the Mediterranean sea lanes had been the decisive theatre, even more than the desert battlefields. He never used the specific figure of 60%, the loss rate that characterized the worst months of Malta's campaign against his supplies. But he understood the reality that figure represented. He understood that he had fought two wars simultaneously, the visible war of tanks and infantry in the desert, and the invisible war of convoys and submarines in the Mediterranean. He won many battles in the visible war. He lost the invisible war completely. Malta's war was not glamorous. There were no great tank charges across the desert, no dramatic breakthroughs, no famous generals becoming legends. There were only submarines creeping through clear Mediterranean waters, aircraft launching from cratered runways, surface ships sailing into the darkness to intercept convoys by radar and moonlight. There were only civilians sheltering underground while bombs obliterated their homes, rationing bread and water while their island slowly starved. But this unglamorous war, this war of logistics and mathematics and slow strangulation, proved decisive. Rommel, the Desert Fox, perhaps the most celebrated German general of the war, was defeated not by a superior tactician but by the cold reality of insufficient supplies. Every time he advanced, his logistics stretched thinner. Every time he attacked, his consumption outran his delivery. And always, relentlessly, the forces based on that tiny island in the middle of the Mediterranean ensured that his convoys never arrived intact. The George Cross on Malta's flag today commemorates this achievement. It recognizes not just the suffering of the siege, but the strategic contribution that suffering enabled. Malta held. Malta fought back. And by holding and fighting, Malta ensured that the Axis tide in North Africa would recede. What Rommel said about this, in the end, was acknowledgement wrapped in complaint. He understood what had happened, even if he never fully articulated it. The speck of rock he had dismissed as something that should have been neutralized months ago had instead neutralized him. The mathematics of supply, the grinding attrition of convoy warfare, the patient destruction of his logistics had achieved what no battlefield defeat could. He fought brilliantly and lost slowly. And the reason was always the same. A tiny island, 95 square miles of limestone in the Mediterranean, populated by people who refused to surrender and defended by forces that never stopped attacking. That is what Malta did. And that is why, more than 80 years later, the George Cross still flies on Malta's flag, testament to an island fortress that helped win a war by ensuring that the enemy's supplies never arrived. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.